Join me in my continued quest to find the greatest movie ever made. Today we take a look at 1973. Welcome to my ranking of films which came out in 1973, or at least the ones that I've seen anyway, and there are 12 of them according to the lists I looked at on Wikipedia. This is more than the amount that we had for the 71 and 72 rankings, so a new record today. I've decided, by the way, that 10 is going to be the minimum amount of films for each of these yearly rankings. So if we get to say, I don't know, 1976, and I realise that I've only seen 6 particular films from that year, then I will make the effort to watch 4 more to get us up to at least 10, but hopefully that won't happen. Now, just a reminder that this is not just a ranking, it's also a competition. The film which finishes first today will go through to the eventual grand final of 100 films further down the line, and the film which comes second will go into a playoff to probably also get into the grand final. I won't be able to include all the films which come second, but I'll be able to include most of them. So let's get into it then. This is going to be a trip down memory lane for you old fogies out there, and something of an education for you young whippersnappers who've never seen anything older than Avatar. So let's find out what is my 12th favourite movie that was released in 1973. So straight away we have a bit of a shock. The Exorcist in last place. I only watched this last week actually. I thought to myself, I can't do a 1973 rankings without having The Exorcist included in there. So I rented it, watched it, and I could not believe just how little I got out of it actually. This has always been the one big horror film that I'd never seen. It actually made me feel quite uncomfortable sometimes actually, the knowledge that somebody might find out I'd never seen The Exorcist when I call myself a horror nut. But there you have it. It's never been one of my favourite subgenres, you know, demon possession. I only opened myself up to the possibility a few years ago of watching The Exorcist because I got into the Conjuring films and really enjoyed those. But this film feels really dated. I don't get why it's so beloved. I mean, expectations probably affected my viewing the other night. You know, I mean, I was literally sat there after 10 minutes thinking, come on, Exorcist, do something. You're supposed to be scary. But no, nothing happened at all. There was no scene I enjoyed in this film. Now, I am willing to sort of maybe watch it again in the future without the expectations. I think that could be interesting, and maybe I'll even do a review when I watch it the second time down the line. But certainly, as of right now, I did not like it at all, and it was a very easy decision to put it last in today's list. This is one of Martin Scorsese's early films. It feels like an early version of Goodfellas, though it's definitely not as good as that. It's not as polished, and it definitely had a lower budget, I imagine. There's just not much story here, and the main character played by Harvey Keitel, even after spending 2 hours with him, I had no clue what his deal was or what his motivations were. The reason why I do like this film a tiny bit, enough to put it ahead of The Exorcist, is because of Johnny Boy, played by Robert De Niro, an absolutely wildly entertaining character. He's sort of like a gangster version of Rodney Trotter with that hairdo, or maybe Liam Gallagher would be a better comparison. But I don't like the ending. It's pretty vague, and I was just left thinking, what? So Scorsese, when he was still very, very rough and still learning the trade, I think, although don't take my word for it because it's got 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, it is critically acclaimed. I just think that if you come to Mean Streets after watching a lot of Scorsese's later work, then you won't be as impressed as if you'd have watched it back in 1973. This is the third and final film in the Shaft trilogy, and it's also my least favourite. And the main reason for that is because, well, Shaft goes to Africa. I think he's much better in Harlem. I think that place just fits him like a glove. So yeah, I prefer the first two by some distance, actually. And I don't think it helped that I watched these films back to back to back 3 weeks running. I think by the time I got to the third one, I was a little bit tired by then. Maybe if I watched Shaft in Africa now, all these years later, I might enjoy it a little bit more. You know, I'm a completely different age now than I was back when I was a teenager, when I originally watched these. I'd certainly like to watch the remakes at some point. I believe there are 2 of them. I'd like to at least see them by the time that I do the rankings for whatever year they came out in anyway. This is a kind of crime drama thriller with lots of double crossing and suitcases full of money and stuff. From what I can remember anyway, it's a long time since I saw this one as well. It was my dad who recommended this one to me. It came on TV one day and he says, "Oh, you've got to watch this." And his big reason for getting me to watch it was because apparently it had an awesome villain. He was like, "Oh, you've got to see this villain. He's a right nasty bastard, this guy." And I thought, okay, this sounds intriguing. I mean, he was making out that this villain was like Thanos or something, from the Marvel movies. I wouldn't say he was that good. He was okay. He's played by Joe Don Baker, the villain, I believe, and he gets a really good death at the end. That's about the only thing I can remember about the film, really. This is not a film that I can imagine anybody would really watch today, unless you're really old and you sort of remember it from back then. It's an okay film from the time, but it's nothing special. Although it did at least make number 9 on this list, I suppose. This is the original version of the Crazies, obviously. It's one of George Romero's early efforts. It came out between Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, that kind of period. I only watched it for the first time quite recently, actually. I bought a Blu-ray by Arrow, and I'd intended to review it after I'd watched it, but once I had watched it, even though I enjoyed it, I'd probably give it like 3 out of 5 if I was to rate it. I just didn't feel like reviewing it. It's not like I review every single horror film that I watch. I just didn't feel any particular energy from this film to go ahead with the review, so I stuck the Blu-ray on the shelf and moved on. But it's not a bad film, not at all. I do prefer the remake from 2010, though, it has to be said. This is a horror anthology film by Amicus. I forget exactly how many stories are on this, but the framing device involves a group of guys getting into an elevator in a really tall building, and they go down into the basement, and there's a guy down there who starts telling them all these stories. That's the general gist anyway. I would say that this is possibly my least favourite of the 7 horror anthologies that Amicus did, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad film. It is quite high on this 1973 rankings. Amicus didn't know how to do bad horror anthologies as far as I'm concerned. Even their sort of weaker ones were still extremely watchable, still very good, and I would absolutely recommend giving this a shot if you're into these type of films. So now we've arrived into the top half of the rankings with Enter the Dragon, one of my 2 favourite Bruce Lee films of all time, the other being Big Boss. John Saxon's in this. If you're into your horror, you might know him from Nightmare on Elm Street and Black Christmas. I was rooting for him all the way through this movie because I was so convinced he was going to die. Because Bruce Lee's the star, I thought, oh, John Saxon's going to be like the sacrificial lamb who gets killed at some point. So I was absolutely delighted when he was still standing at the end. There is this other good guy in the film called Williams, I think, who gets killed halfway through, and that was a real gut punch to me when I was watching this. But if you're into your sort of old school martial arts stuff with Bruce Lee at the helm, then you'll absolutely love Enter the Dragon. It's a great film. So for the second time in this series, a James Bond film is eliminated by coming 5th. Diamonds Are Forever suffered exactly the same fate in the 1971 rankings. I'm a massive James Bond nut, so this is sort of noteworthy to me that we've now had 2 Bond films and none of them have really done anything in these lists. Are any of the Bond films going to make it to the grand final, or will they keep getting pipped by the standalone films that I really appreciate throughout time? I don't know. It's going to be fascinating to see. Granted, Diamonds and Live and Let Die are not 2 of my all-time favourite Bond films, so I guess we'll see what happens when we get to the better ones. In terms of Live and Let Die, it was Roger Moore's first Bond film. It was sort of made in an era where I think the Bond films started to look a little bit cheap for a while, but this one's okay. It's at least very entertaining. It's got all sorts of random stuff in this one. It's got a great villain, though. It's got a great Bond girl, and it's still a great time, even though I'd probably say it's one of the lesser ones. This is the oldest film starring Al Pacino that I've personally seen, and already on this list we've had the oldest film starring Robert De Niro that I've seen. I think their career paths took a similar trajectory. They are roughly the same age, but in terms of head-to-head, this is definitely a battle which Pacino wins for my money because I like Serpico and I'm not that keen on Mean Streets, as we've already discussed. Serpico is a film about police corruption and the battle against it. It feels very realistic, like a set of events which might have actually happened. I don't know if it was based on a true story, actually. The character of Serpico is very fascinating and at times infuriating, it has to be said, but this is definitely a very solid drama. Highly recommended if you like Al Pacino, but you've yet to see this particular film. Now, we're about to get into the top 3, and let me tell you, there is a massive gulf in class, as far as I'm concerned, between the top 3 films on this list and the 9 films below them. I had a hard time separating these top 3 into the gold, silver, bronze positions, but there was never any doubt in my mind that these 3 would be top of the pack. So let's find out which film is third and has definitely missed out on a place in the grand final. Yes, kids, Westworld existed long before the TV show came along, mainly in the form of this film from the early 70s. It's a brilliant blend of sci-fi and horror. It's a hugely original concept. I just love the fake Western environment that they came up with for this film. I just want to go there myself, even though it might be slightly dangerous, obviously. Who can forget Yul Brynner's gunslinger gone crazy? The last 15-20 minutes of this film are absolutely amazing. It's a real ride. I've seen this film 3-4 times since I first saw it as a teenager. I've never gotten around to watching the sequel though, but that's going to change. I've just recently ordered a Blu-ray copy of Future World because I'm quite certain we'll be getting to the year that Future World came out quite soon, and I'd like to be able to include that in my rankings for whatever year that it came out. Now, in terms of the Westworld TV show, I've seen the first 2 seasons and not the third. I thought the first season was one of the best seasons of TV I've ever seen in my life, easily on a par with the original film. Second season, it was okay, but maybe not quite so good. I didn't quite like where most of the storylines went, and I've just never got around to watching the third season. Maybe when the whole thing is finally finished, I'll go back and binge the whole thing. I don't know yet. So in the playoff position, we have High Plains Drifter, a western starring Clint Eastwood. This is about a guy with no name who travels to this small town and helps them prepare for the arrival of 3 vicious gunslingers who are about to be released from prison, and they want revenge on this small town. This is a very violent film. It's almost dreamlike at times, but it's very, very good. I'm not sure it would be for everybody because it is quite a slow burn, like a lot of westerns actually, but this is another film which I have appreciated ever since I was a teenager. I've seen it several times. It's got this one amazing scene in it which I always remember, where Eastwood is sat on the porch of this saloon and this guy is creeping up behind him with a knife, getting ready to assassinate him, and Eastwood, without even turning around, says, "You know, you're going to look awful silly with that knife sticking out of your ass." And this guy holding the knife behind him just sort of goes, and then turns around and walks off. Absolutely brilliant. But it's a really good film, very underrated. Hardly ever hear anybody talking about High Plains Drifter. Right, we are about to find out what is officially my favourite film from 1973. Drum roll and badam. And at number 1 we have Magnum Force, another Clint Eastwood film. Eastwood's done very well in this list. Magnum Force was the second film in the Dirty Harry franchise, and if you were with me for my 1971 rankings, you might remember that I had Dirty Harry second in that list. So it could be that we have 2 Dirty Harry films in the grand finale 100, but why not? Harry Callahan's a great character, and I love following his adventures around San Francisco. I used to think that Dirty Harry was the better of the first 2 movies, but having done a recent rewatch of both films, I actually think that they're more side by side actually, and I couldn't tell you at all which one I would put ahead of the other in the grand finale if they both get there. Magnum Force feels like a story which could actually happen. You know, it's a tale about police corruption, not too dissimilar, I guess, from Serpico, although Magnum Force has got the better action stuff in it, and that's probably why I much prefer it over the more kind of drama feel of Serpico. So there we have it. Magnum Force is our winner for this week, but I have one more question that needs answering before I wrap up. Yes, in fact, I'm going to name you 5 films which I sort of regret not having seen in time for this video. 2 of them are non-horror and 3 of them are horror. So I'll start with the non-horror ones. You've got The Day of the Jackal, which is a thriller I've always been sort of curious about but never quite got around to. And then there's a film called The Sting, starring Robert Redford and Paul Newman, which I believe won a whole bunch of Oscars. And I think I might have seen a bit of this, actually. If that film ends with a scene in a bookies, then I might well have seen it. But I can't remember enough of it to definitively put it on the list. Now, in terms of horror, there's a film called And Now the Screaming Starts, which is a Peter Cushing film I've not seen yet. I want to see it just because it got Cushing in it, basically. There's another one called The Creeping Flesh, again with Cushing, and that one's got Christopher Lee in it as well. So these are just horror films that I would like to get around to at some point. And there's another horror film which I thought looked interesting when I spotted it on Wiki the other day, The Legend of Hell House. So there you go, there's a bunch of films which certainly I could possibly see myself watching in the future, but unfortunately they didn't make it into this video. So there you have it. That is the end of my rankings of the films that I've seen in 1973. Magnum Force is the winner, and High Plains Drifter may also join it in the grand final further down the line. I'll be back very soon with the rankings for 1974. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.